Okay, let's talk about a number so massive it's almost hard to wrap your head around. The U.S. national debt. You hear about it in the news all the time, but what does it actually mean? Well, we're going to break it all down. So let's just start with the big, jaw-dropping number. As of late 2025, the U.S. national debt soared to an incredible $38 trillion. That is a 38 with 12 zeros after it. But honestly, it's the speed at which it's growing that is just mind-blowing. Get this. To give you an idea of that speed, the debt jumped by a full $1 trillion in just 71 days. If you do the math, that means the debt was climbing by more than $192,000 every single second. It went up by more than $1 million in the time it took me to say that sentence. Unbelievable. So we see these shocking numbers, right? But what are we even talking about when we say national debt? Let's get a really clear definition. Okay, at its simplest, the national debt is the grand total of all the money the U.S. government has borrowed to cover its bills. See, every year, if the government spends more than it brings in from taxes, that creates what's called a deficit. To cover that gap, it borrows money by selling treasury bonds. The national debt is just all those yearly deficits added up over the entire nation's history. Now, here's something you might not know. This debt isn't just one giant IOU to other countries. It's actually split into two big buckets. First, you've got debt held by the public. That's what we usually think of, the government borrowing from investors both here and abroad. But then there's intragovernmental debt. This is a weird one. It's basically the government borrowing from itself, from trust funds like Social Security, kind of like taking money out of your savings account to cover your credit card bill. And that brings up a really important question. If the U.S. is borrowing all this cash, who exactly are the lenders? Who are we borrowing all this money from? Well, the answer might actually surprise you. So if you look at the whole pie, a huge chunk is that intragovernmental debt we just talked about. Yep, the government owes itself. Then the Federal Reserve holds a big piece, and so do regular domestic investors. Things like pension funds, insurance companies, and banks right here in the U.S. So a massive portion of America's debt is actually owed to, well, Americans. Okay, but what about other countries? There's this huge myth that China is America's biggest banker, right? Well, let's just look at the data. As you can see, that's not actually true. As of late 2025, Japan was the #1 foreign holder of U.S. debt, followed by the UK. China comes in third, and its share has actually been shrinking for a few years now. All right, so now we know what the debt is and who owns it. But let's get to the big question. Why should any of us care? I mean, what are the actual real-world consequences of this number just going up and up and up? Well, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, lays out some pretty serious risks. For one, a huge national debt can crowd out private investment. Basically, the government is borrowing so much money that there's less available for businesses and families. That can slow down the whole economy. It also means we're more likely to see higher taxes or cuts to other government programs down the road. And maybe most importantly, it ties our hands, leaving us with less flexibility to deal with the next big crisis, whatever that might be. And if you want a perfect example of a direct consequence that's happening right now, here it is. In 2024, we crossed a pretty shocking milestone. For the first time, the U.S. government spent more money on just the interest payments for the debt than it did on the entire national defense budget. Just let that sink in for a second. The money we're spending just to service our past borrowing is now more than the cost of funding our entire military. That's a huge shift in our country's financial priorities. So, that's where we stand today. The obvious question is, where are we heading? What does the future look like if we stay on this path? Let's take a look at the official projections. According to that same CBO, if nothing changes, the debt held by the public is on track to hit 116% of our GDP by 2034. Now, GDP is basically the size of the entire U.S. economy. For some perspective, the historical average for debt to GDP after World War II was around 40%. This projection shows our debt is growing way, way faster than our economy is. And all of this brings us to the most important question of all, doesn't it? This isn't just some abstract economic debate. We've seen the debt is growing at a dizzying pace. It's already changing how we spend our money, and it's projected to outpace our entire economy. The decisions being made right now are creating obligations that are going to last for decades. So as this number keeps on climbing, the real question we have to ask ourselves is, what's the true cost for future generations? And who is going to be left holding the bill?